And yeah, so as Adam said, throughout this presentation, we're going to share with you the importance of historical mapping in the context of contaminated land risk assessment, and also show you some examples of what our consultants look out for when interpreting historical maps. I'm sure is the same case for many of you out there that I've got my children at home with me, so apologies in advance if you hear them tearing shreds off each other. Now, the Ordnance Survey was founded in 1791. Its original driving purpose was to map militarily important areas following the Jacobite rebellion in the Scottish Highlands in 1745 and the Napoleonic Wars in 1803 to 1815. The Victorians saw the benefit of maps for social and industrial planning. In 1841, the Ordnance Survey Act formalised the OS in law and gave right to enter any land for purposes of surveying. The OS is responsible for naming conventions. Formally, places may have more than one name or be spelled in various ways. And here at Groundsure, we have a very comprehensive collection of historical maps, around 1.3 million. These were sourced directly from the Ordnance Survey in Southampton, as well as Trinity College in Dublin. And we also pride ourselves on the quality of our historical mapping, where we've set a new industry standards, because all of our mapping was scanned in at over 500 dots per inch. Other providers, so the image on the right, scanned in at only 300 dots per inch. This means that the clarity and resolution of our mapping is much higher, meaning the digitisation of our historical land use database is much more accurate. So to give you a bit of context, the Environment Agency estimate that around 300,000 hectares of land in England and Wales is affected to some extent by industrial contamination. However, the research that we've undertaken here at Groundsure using our unique historical mapping data has revealed that around 620,000 hectares was formerly covered by a wide range of industrial sites, more than double the Environment Agency's figures. This equates to around 4% of land in England and Wales. And if you think that just 0.007% or just over 1,000 hectares of England and Wales landmass is officially designated as contaminated land, as set out in Part 2A of the Environmental Protection Act, this research that we've done suggests that there is significant potential for more contaminated land sites to be identified based on the variance in brownfield land estimation. The purchaser of any site should be made aware that they can inherit contaminated land even if they did not cause it. This means that they will be responsible for cleaning up the area, which can run into tens to hundreds of thousands of pounds. There's more than 22,000 historic landfill sites as recorded by the Environment Agency, and over 2,000 active landfill sites in the UK. And to give you an idea of what we did with these historical maps, so on the left you can see the original paper copy maps. All of the land uses were identified and labelled by hand to enable the next process of digitisation the data. This is the same location as the paper map, but a digital copy. Now, the next process was to go through the 1.3 million maps and polygonise and label any relevant features in terms of contaminated land. This makes up our historical land use database, and it underpins the Groundsure business. So we've collated a lot of unique data sets, such as Part 2A sites, any infill land, historical tanks, garages, military sites, and petrol stations. And I'll go through some of these data sets with you in the coming slides, just to demonstrate their significance. So how do we identify which sites have a contaminated land issue? We use the Ordnance Survey 6-inch to the mile mapping and the more detailed 25-inch to the mile mapping to allow specific features of concern to be seen more clearly in urban areas, as well as greater detail for buildings and railways. On the screen is a 6-inch to the mile map from 1938 of Stamford. It is said that when we use this mapping, we'll go back to 1842. Well, this is when mapping became sufficiently credible, consistent and accurate. It also marks the starting point whereby the whole country was initially surveyed between 1842 and 1893. Every road, railway, field, fence, wall, stream and building is shown, and even smaller features such as letterboxes, bollards on quaysides, mileposts and flagstaffs are on the mapping as well. Within the mapping, uncultivated land is distinguished by different symbols for marsh, bog and rough grassland. Types of woodland are distinguished, as well as parks, ornamental grounds and orchards. All public boundaries and administrative boundaries are clearly shown, apart from certain boundaries within towns. So if we have a look at this map, what can we see on there? There's lots of residential properties. We can see Rutland Engineering Works in the centre, and to the south we can see a lime works. We can see some suspicious buildings above Huddle Mill, just down in the bottom above London Midland Railway line. And these suspicious buildings don't seem to be labelled, so there's a question mark over them. Are they associated with the sewage works? What are they actually being used for? There's a river flowing next to it, so the land would be liable to flooding as well, as it's on a functional floodplain. Here's the same location using the more detailed 25-inch to the mile mapping. As you can see, it does allow specific features of concern to be seen more clearly. Now we can see that the Rutland Engineering Works is in more detail, and it's also geographically located. The lime works is shown to be the Priory Lime Works, which is housing old kilns. We can again see the sewage works with the filter beds to the south of the site, and the suspicious buildings in the fields are actually labelled as sludge lagoons, which is obviously a delightful land use. If we go further on in time to 1960, we can see that the Rutland Engineering Works is now simply labelled as a works. This is what we call the Cold War era mapping, where nationally important and strategic sites were labelled more generically. This is why you'll see sites listed as unspecified works from time to time. This means that the true nature of the land is potentially hidden, and I'll go through that in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. If you look to the south, you can also see the sewage works is now labelled as a works. We can see the symbology by the allotments, which seems to indicate that some form of waste has been deposited on the field. These maps come with keys and symbols, and our environmental consultant's job is to read and interpret these symbols to tell us exactly how the land was being used and derive a risk profile from them. So another data set we have on our system is petrol stations, and these only tend to be labelled as such on large scale mapping. They will only be labelled as a filling petrol station if no other services are offered, such as selling food, etc., where they can be labelled as a garage. If this is the case, and you need to know definitively if petrol was sold, then there are a few distinctive features to look out for. Whilst it may be obvious for existing petrol stations, some that have been converted may not be as obvious. If you're using Google Street View or undertaking a site investigation, a few obvious features to look out for are the interceptors. These look a bit like manhole covers, but this is where the fuel is pumped into the pumps. Interceptors are usually in groups of 3 and next to each other. A telltale sign when looking at historic maps is the site having 2 entrances or exits. There is also a canopy involved as well. As these are open-sided structures, they will be represented on mapping with a dashed line rather than a solid line, as can be seen in the image on the left. Now, if we move on to heaps and pits, the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps record practically all man-made and natural features in the landscape. The permanent detail of quarries, pits, slag heaps and refuse tips is shown, with the type of mineral extracted named before about 1859. So a few tips for distinguishing between heaps and pits. The largest of the slope symbol indicates the part that would be closest to you if you were looking from above. Imagine the lines of equal width so that you can see them from a 3D perspective. There are also some quite distinguishing features of what tend to be slag heaps or refuse heaps. These usually represented as small dots. You can also infer what these have been filled with based on the surrounding land uses. Local knowledge can go a long way. We know that many of the heaps in the areas of Widnes, Halton and Runcorn are quite nasty. They are more likely filled with a chemical waste known as galley goo. Now, galley goo is a byproduct of a process that converted rock salt into sodium carbonate. Galley goo contains high levels of arsenic and other heavy metals, as well as the pollution risk posed. Galley goo's uncontrolled disposal in areas surrounding the factories has resulted in significant ground stability problems. It is estimated that the production process produced 2 tons of galley goo for every 1 ton of soda ash, and at its heights in the 1870s, Britain's soda output of around 200,000 tons annually exceeded that of the rest of the world combined. The resulting millions of tons of waste galley goo were either dumped into spoil heaps or spread on the ground surface to infill valleys or build embankments. Hundreds of hectares of Widnes, Runcorn and St Helens are underlain by this waste, which places a significant constraint of development because of its unique physical properties. In the 1970s, the St Michael's Golf Course was created on the northern section of a former chemical tip for industrial waste products, following some minor reclamation work. The southern 9 holes were established in the 1980s when environmental standards had started to improve. However, evidence arose of contamination in Stewards Brook, which run through the golf course. It was termed by the locals as the River of Jizz. And it was so corrosive that if your golf ball fell in, it was never coming back. In 2004, studies were undertaken on the brook and wider course, which led to partial closure of the course in 2004. And then in 2009, the council successfully obtained £2.47 million of funding for the remediation of the northern section. In 2016, after the creation of the new course, it finally reopened to the public 12 years after its initial closure. Now, there are issues associated with embankments. If they are in proximity to gasworks, they may have used gasworks waste as an engineering material, particularly foul lime. Also, cuttings. These are often infilled when the rail line has been removed. Many smaller rail lines were closed in the 1960s prior to the Control of Pollution Act of 1974, and therefore could have been subject to uncontrolled waste deposition. Now, Stanley Baldwin, the first Earl Baldwin of Bewdley, was a British Conservative statesman who dominated the government of the United Kingdom between the World Wars, serving as Prime Minister on 3 occasions. Censorship of mapping started in 1927, with the well-founded fears of a wartime aerial blitz. Around that time, that Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin actually warned that the bomber will always get through. He secretly instructed that no work of defence shall appear upon any map on sale to the general public. No blank space shall appear, but the natural physical features of the country shall continue to appear. Map makers eventually protested that there was no point in deleting, for example, power stations, because power lines converged on a mysteriously blank spot. As you will be able to see on the following slides, some were clearly more successful at concealing their uses than others. So this is ROF Risley. It was a large World War II Royal Ordnance factory used for filling munitions, including the Grand Slam bombs in the UK. It is located roughly halfway between Liverpool and Manchester. The location was chosen because the low-lying mist and cloud helped camouflage the factory from the air. According to a local builder, it was very lonely and misty at night, and that's why the factory was constructed there. It was usually covered with a mist or cloud. One of the features common to all filling factories was an area of storage bunkers where the finished munitions were stored awaiting dispatch. The areas within the filling factories were all numbered in the same way. Storage bunkers were designated Area 9. Risley has 20 such bunkers, and Area 9 is roughly in the area of the main field in Birchwood Forest Park today. When the new town of Birchwood was created, most of the bunkers were demolished, but 4 of them were left in place and can still be seen there to this day. A number of bunkers were also built to house munitions, to protect them for potential bombing, and also to segregate the site and reduce the consequences of any accidental explosions during manufacture or storage. Although these bunkers are on the surface, they are covered with soil and turf, and so give the impression of being underground. It has a dedicated rail link to the Manchester Wigan branch line, which was used both for bringing in workers and also moving materials. Now, whether through Cold War paranoia or legitimate security concerns, as it further decided in 1957 that all descriptions of factories, works, mills and collieries would also be erased and replaced with generic terms. For example, an asbestos roofing works, as noted on mapping, would hereafter be referred to as a works only. Whilst this was relaxed in around 1964, descriptions were only permitted if it is quite clear that these are unlikely to change and must only be in the most general terms. Whilst many factories used for military purposes were already and continued in industrial use, historical mapping will not give you the full picture of the activities undertaken there. Sutton Oak Factory in St Helens was used in World War I for the manufacture of synthetic phenol, and latterly for the manufacture of chemical warfare agents, including sarin gas, mustard gas, and many experimental chemical agents, until its closure in 1957. During both World War I and World War II, many sites in existing industrial use were requisitioned for use as ordnance factories, shell filling factories, explosive manufacture, chemical warfare manufacture, and other uses to support the war effort. In most cases, these wartime uses would not have been detailed on any maps and survive only as local knowledge and within National Archive records. We've undertaken here at Groundsure an independent research to identify many of these sites, from Royal Ordnance factories to chemical warfare manufacturers. The database currently holds hundreds of sites covering just short of 17,000 hectares of land within England, Wales and Scotland. Future research projects will add sites on a rolling basis. These sites appear across the country, from the Chemical Weapons Research Establishment at Portreath in Cornwall to our RAF Kinloss near Elgin in Morayshire. Just a few more tips on the types of features or layout to look out for which are indicative of ordnance or military sites. They are often unlabelled. Sometimes they'll have the word depot in there. There's lots of embankments for protecting against the explosive risk, as I mentioned earlier. A very regimented layout, as you can see there, which will obviously give the highlight of it being a military site. And they are often very large areas with large spaces between the units as well. Here's another example for you, which is Chatham Docks on the River the River Medway in Kent, sorry. On the left, it is from 1933. You'll see that it's a large industrial site. And in the middle, from 1938, this is the year before World War II, with a large area that's completely been blanked out, which obviously isn't suspicious at all. And then on the right, you've got 1955. The whole area has now been whited out. Now, this is now turned into a residential development by Redrow Homes. And it turns out that this used to be a nuclear submarine filling station. And they've got this large residential development on there, and the nuclear waste will have been buried deep underground, covered with concrete and sealed off so that none of the waste can actually get out. But it is still there. And as I said, there's a lot of residential units actually on top of it. Now, during the Cold War, the Ministry of Defence listed 4,800 key points to be deleted. Martin Furnivall-Jones, who became the head of MI5, worried about saboteurs. He wanted oil refineries, gasworks and railway bridges to be removed, even insisting that all factories should have their role concealed because it would be very useful to any agent. This is the origin of the uninformative word works appearing on maps to this day. Another important thing that we go through, and especially if you're dealing with developers, is in and around places like Coventry, Portsmouth and London especially, is how to identify possible bomb damage to an area. On the 14th of November 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its most devastating bombing raid of the Second World War. The biggest target was Coventry, which is a manufacturing city in the heart of England with a beautiful medieval centre. The result was a shocking collapse of social order that caused thousands to flee, with thousands of homes and industries destroyed or damaged. So without official bomb damage maps, can historical Ordnance Survey maps give you an indication of where bombs were dropped? And the answer is yes. Historical maps serve a very useful purpose. This is a map from Coventry from 1949, which is obviously after the war. You can clearly see how many ruins there are labelled on the map. The label ruin on an historical map implies war damage and the possible need for an unexploded ordnance survey assessment to be done, again, in terms of developers that might be looking and don't want to find any unexploded bombs on the site once they start digging. Now, if we move on to mills, mills can mean any industrial buildings, especially in the north of England. There is sometimes a perception that mills just means relatively benign things such as flour mills, corn mills and the like, but they can be literally any industrial use, as you will see on the following slides. This is Acre Mill in the old town of Hebden Bridge. In 1859, the site of Acre Mill was chosen to house a cotton mill because of the plentiful water supply. However, less than a decade later, it became a site people would rather forget. Now, in 1939, Cape Insulation Limited took over the site. They were an asbestos processing company. They mine asbestos in South Africa, exporting it to Europe for widespread use in insulation and to produce a fire retardant goods. Asbestos cement sheets, rope lagging, insulation mattresses, and asbestos cloth and yarn were also produced at the site. Cape Insulation Limited took over the site to meet the demands for producing filters for gas masks during World War II. They occupied the site until 1970. The mill was subject of a 1971 World in Action investigation entitled The Dust at Acre Mill, which revealed how the factory broke the law regarding asbestos dust control between 1940 and 1970. By 1979, 12% of a total of 2,200 former employees had asbestos-related disease. The mill was then demolished in 1979. You can see on the mapping here that the site was never actually labelled as an asbestos mill. Therefore, caution should be exercised when interpreting the historical mapping. As we said at the beginning, the word mill can be used to describe many industries. Just to show an example of other types of mill, here we have a bone mill, which is incorporated with a chemical manure works, which I'm sure, as this site is near Mansfield, and I'm sure the smell of getting off the train at Leeming Lane Station was absolutely delightful. Now, if you see a mill in a rural area and it's away from other industry, it's more than likely going to be a corn mill, which obviously grinds cereal grain into flour and middlings. The term can refer to both the grinding mechanism and the building that holds it. Here you can see that there's also a chalk pit in close proximity. Now, any sort of pit would be a red flag to us here at Groundsure. These were often infilled when the pit had completely emptied of its mineral. And we've seen it before when having issues with ground stability. There was a case from St Albans a few years ago as well, where they'd built residential properties on a chalk pit and infill them with any old sort of rubbish they can get their hands on. I think there was also a gravel pit there. Now, the problem is when you infill land back in the 1900s and build properties when there aren't any environmental regulations in place, such as the 1960s or 70s, then the things underneath the ground will disappear away. We have heavy rainfall, there's nothing underneath to support the ground, and we'll see quite large sinkholes opening up. So again, it's a red flag to us when we see the word pit anywhere. And this is of the same area, but this is the higher detailed 25-inch to the mile mapping. And it confirms to us that it is a corn mill. Again, reiterating the importance of having the more detailed mapping. We can also see the detail of a pond that is associated with the mill, which would again be something we'd look into, as ponds were often used to dispose of waste from many sites. So here we have a few useful resources for you. We have included the line to our historic mapping legend, as well as a link for the mapping abbreviations and symbols. If you'd like a copy of the slides, then just let us know and we can send these over after the session. There's also a really useful book called Ordnance Survey Maps, a concise guide for historians. At Groundsure, this book comes out almost on a daily basis, and it is really helpful as well. And then you have us, you also have us, the Groundsure team. We have a wealth of in-house experts who are on hand to answer all of your questions with regards to mapping and data. And we always like to say that on the very bottom of our environmental reports is our direct contact number. If your clients ever have a question about one of our reports, then they can get in touch with us directly and actually speak to one of our environmental consultants who will happily go through the environmental report with them, making it a lot easier for you and saving you guys a lot of time as well. We also have a large collection of historical maps, as I mentioned, and if you do require map packs for the area, especially go down well if you're dealing with environmental consultants or property developers as well, then we can produce historical map packs for you of any given area just to see what was there, or if you're interested to see what was around where you live previously, then we can get those over to you too. And that's everything from me. Thank you very much for your time today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your week, and I'll pass you back over to Adam.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much for doing that. And thank you to everyone for attending this morning. So that's just half an hour taken out of your day. So hopefully everyone's well. It just leaves me to sign off and say thank you everyone for joining, and I will end the webinar there. Thank you, bye.